How did a private army, born from the ashes of apartheid, shape modern military history and redefine conflict in Africa? Imagine a force for hire, armed to the teeth, highly trained and willing to wage war, not for their country or a cause, but for any nation who could afford their services. In the power vacuums left by crumbling post-colonial states, where rebel groups and warlords thrived amid weak and corrupt governments, such an entity could shift the balance of power overnight. In the 1990s, as the world moved away from the proxy battles of the Cold War, a new breed of armed force was emerging, one that blurred the lines between the state and the private sector, and between soldiers and mercenaries. This was the dawn of the modern PMCs, private military companies where war became a service that could be outsourced, bought, and sold. The decline of traditional state-led military interventions created a gap that needed filling, particularly in Africa, where many countries were left grappling with insurgencies, civil wars, and the chaotic aftermath of Cold War geopolitics. The major powers, fatigued by their own military commitments and wary of getting embroiled in messy post-colonial conflicts, began to withdraw their direct involvement. Into this void stepped private military contractors, a new kind of force that promised not just boots on the ground, but highly skilled operatives capable of executing complex operations with precision and efficiency. These were not the disorganized and ideologically driven mercenaries of the past. These were highly trained and motivated units that combined military expertise with corporate business models. This is where Executive Outcomes comes in. A company that would soon become the most infamous and effective of these new private armies. Formed in 1989 by former soldiers of the South African Defence Force, Executive Outcomes, or EO, brought a new level of professionalism and organisation to private warfare that had never been seen before. These weren't rogue mercenaries operating outside of international law. Executive Outcomes was a corporate entity with a structured hierarchy, clear objectives, and a business model that centered on providing military services to any nation with deep enough pockets. At the core of EO's operations lay a novel concept: military expertise and firepower as a service available to the highest bidder. This mercenary army arose in the aftermath of the Cold War and the disintegration of apartheid South Africa, exploiting a power vacuum created by collapsing post-colonial states, rife with civil strife and corruption. The fading dominance of state-led military interventions necessitated alternative security solutions in regions where insurgent groups and warlords thrived amid weak and often impoverished national governments. To fully grasp the rise of Executive Outcomes, we must look back at apartheid-era South Africa and its formidable military machine, the South African Defence Force, or the SADF. The SADF was more than just an army. It was a battle-hardened force sculpted by decades of intense, high-stakes conflict, often acting alone in light of international sanction, operating as both the sword and the shield of the apartheid regime. Established in 1957, the SADF became one of Africa's most potent military forces, renowned for its rigorous training programs, innovative tactics, and exceptional combat effectiveness. Guided by a doctrine of counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare, the SADF conducted extensive campaigns against various liberation movements, both within South Africa and across its borders. The military's total strategy policy was designed to counter both internal dissent and external threats through a combination of military, political, and psychological operations. SADF forces frequently deployed to neighboring states like Angola, Namibia, then Southwest Africa, and Mozambique to battle Soviet-backed insurgent groups and liberation movements. The SADF wasn't just a conventional military force. It was an adaptable, multi-dimensional war machine composed of elite units that specialized in different facets of combat and intelligence. At its core were legendary groups like the Rekkies, the 32nd Battalion, and Kofut, a paramilitary unit under the South African police. The Rekkies were the epitome of elite special forces, South Africa's answer to the world's most formidable military units. Known for their deep penetration raids, sabotage missions, and intelligence operations, the Rekkies executed some of the most daring operations of the Cold War, employing stealth, precision and guerrilla tactics to carry out missions far behind enemy lines. The 32nd Battalion, or Buffalo Battalion, was another critical component of the SADF's counterinsurgency capabilities. Made up of both South African soldiers and former Angolan insurgents, this unit excelled in guerrilla warfare. Their mastery of the terrain, coupled with their ability to conduct ambushes, hit-and-run operations, and rapid strikes, made them one of the most effective unconventional forces in southern Africa. They operated primarily in the bushlands of Angola and Namibia, often turning the tide against insurgents who vastly outnumbered them through superior tactics and local knowledge. Kofod, meanwhile, was a hybrid force that combined the roles of police intelligence with aggressive military tactics. Known for its brutal effectiveness in counterinsurgency, Kofod used a blend of intelligence-led raids and pseudo-operations, where operatives disguised themselves as insurgents to infiltrate enemy camps and gather intelligence. This unit's methods were as controversial as they were effective, leaving a trail of both military successes and human rights concerns in their wake. But perhaps the darkest arm of the SADF was the Civil Cooperation Bureau, or the CCB, an ultra-secretive unit tasked with covert assassinations, sabotage, and psychological operations. The CCB was not just another unit, it was an entity that operated in the shadows, employing deep cover operatives, front companies, and clandestine networks to manipulate environments to achieve its objectives. The CCB was notorious for its deep cover assassinations and sabotage missions, employing a strategy of plausible deniability that allowed the apartheid government to claim ignorance of its activities. Out of the CCB would emerge the founding father of executive outcomes, Eeben Barlow. By the early 1990s, apartheid was crumbling, Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and South Africa was on the brink of a historic transformation. The SADF, once the apartheid regime's iron fist, was being dismantled to make way for a new, democratic South African National Defence Force. Thousands of elite soldiers found themselves in a country that no longer had use for their brutal, unconventional warfare skills. These were men who had spent their careers perfecting the art of counterinsurgency, deep penetration raids, and sabotage. They weren't just out of a job, they were out of a purpose. And with the Cold War coming to a close and global powers retreating from Africa, there was no shortage of demand for their services. Enter the aforementioned Eeben Barlow, a former SADF officer who had served in military intelligence and had first-hand experience with South Africa's most covert operations. Barlow saw a new market opening up, a market for specialized military services that could provide quick, decisive results in Africa's emerging conflicts. Barlow's vision was audacious. Why not take the tactical genius, discipline, and ferocity of South Africa's elite forces and turn them into a private, corporate army for hire? Thus, in 1989, Executive Outcomes was born. EO wasn't just another mercenary group. No, this was a full-scale professional military service with a corporate twist. EO initially focused on providing special forces training to governments and organizations around the world without any boots on the ground. However, as conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa continued to heat up, Eeben Barlow realized EO could become a force multiplier on the ground. Barlow recruited the best of the best from his old SADF days. Soldiers from the Rekkies, 32nd Battalion, Kofod, and even the CCB. These weren't just former enlisted soldiers. They were seasoned operatives who knew how to wage war in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. They had faced off against Soviet-backed guerrillas, traversed treacherous terrains, and engaged in some of the most daring covert missions of the Cold War era in Africa. And now, as part of EO, they brought all that experience and more to the table. EO's first major contract came in 1993 in Angola, where the socialist MPLA government was on the ropes, fighting a brutal civil war against Jonas Savimbi's UNITA rebels. Angola was a rich country in oil and diamonds, but torn apart by decades of conflict. The government was desperate and willing to pay top dollar for a force that could do what their own army couldn't: turn the tide of war. EO rolled in with around 500 battle-hardened operatives, light armored vehicles, attack helicopters, and a strategy straight out of the SADF playbook. They executed rapid helicopter-borne assaults, combined with ground operations that overwhelmed units' positions. Within months, they reclaimed vital territories in diamond-rich areas that were crucial for the government's survival. This wasn't just warfare, it was a display of how a small, highly skilled force could achieve what entire national armies could not. EO didn't just change the game in Angola, they redefined it. Their success in Angola opened the door to another war-torn country, Sierra Leone. In 1995, EO was hired by the Sierra Leonean government to take on the Revolutionary United Front, a brutal rebel group notorious for its use of child soldiers and horrific tactics. EO again deployed with a small but highly skilled force, using a combination of rapid strikes, psychological warfare, and superior tactics that outmatched the rebels and reclaimed critical diamond mining regions. Their success demonstrated the power of a private military force to stabilize regions where state forces had failed, but it also raised significant ethical questions about the role of private armies in sovereign conflicts. In this video, we're going to be exploring how this private army reshaped the modern battlefield, merging the worlds of corporate strategy and military tactics. Here at the front, we love making, researching, and sharing history content, but it isn't always easy with YouTube's super strict policies. That's where Armchair History TV comes in. Armchair History and the team have created a website that not only supports us as creators, but promotes freedom of speech and expression in content. We've had a long-term partnership with them, and it's been an absolute pleasure producing videos like the Bloody Battle of Iwo Jima, how American grit won the day, and the SS officer who tried to expose the true horrors of the Holocaust without having to stress about whether YouTube will demonetize or take the content down because unfiltered history doesn't suit their policies. To help fight back against this, we'd love you to join us using the link below and with the code THEFRONT on sign up to get 50% off a monthly or annual subscription. You'll get access to an exclusive library of over 250 videos along with consistent exclusive production from myself, Armchair History TV, and Knowledgeia, to name just a few. Hope to see you guys there. Picture South Africa in the late 1980s. A country on the brink of monumental change. The apartheid regime, which had gripped the nation for decades, was finally beginning to crumble. Chaos, uncertainty, and transformation were in the air. It was a time of political turmoil and social upheaval, and out of this volatile environment emerged Executive Outcomes, a private military company that would soon become synonymous with modern warfare in Africa. At the core of this story is Eeben Barlow, a man shaped by South Africa's covert wars and the brutal realities of guerrilla conflict. If you want to understand how Executive Outcomes came to be, you need to understand the man behind it all, Eeben Barlow. Barlow's story starts in northern Rhodesia, what we now know as Zambia, in the early 1950s. Born into a world marked by colonial wars and the rise of the liberation movements, Barlow's childhood was steeped in the complex dynamics of a continent fighting for its future. From a young age, he was captivated by his uncle's stories of World War II heroism and conflict, sparking in him an early passion for military service. This drive eventually led him to South Africa, where he would join the South African Defence Force at a time when the country was arming itself against internal uprisings and external threats. Little did he know, this decision would catapult him into the heart of some of the most secretive and intense military operations of the 20th century. Barlow's first real taste of combat came with the 32nd Battalion, the infamous Buffalo Battalion of the SADF. If there was ever a special force within special forces, the 32nd was it. Known for their proficiency in guerrilla warfare, they were the spearhead in South Africa's fight during the border war in Angola. These weren't your run-of-the-mill soldiers. The 32nd Battalion was made up of South African troops and former Angolan insurgents who specialized in hit-and-run tactics, deep penetration raids, and lightning-fast ambushes. Barlow learned the art of war here. Not just how to fire a gun or lead a squad, but how to think like the enemy, adapt to ever-changing environments, and exploit every possible weakness. It was a brutal education where success meant survival and failure was not an option. But Barlow wasn't just a foot soldier. He was a thinker, a strategist. His journey took him deeper into the shadows when he moved to military intelligence. It was here that Barlow transitioned from the front lines to the invisible world of covert operations. The battlefield wasn't just out there in the bush anymore. It was in boardrooms, in coded messages, and in the minds of enemy leaders. Barlow honed his skills in this secretive realm with the Civil Cooperation Bureau, a covert unit tasked with sabotage, psychological warfare, and assassination. If you think the CIA played dirty, the CCB wrote its own book on covert operations. Barlow wasn't just learning how to fight a war, he was learning how to shape one, bending narratives, manipulating loyalties, and using deception as a weapon. During his time with the CCB, Barlow undertook several high-risk missions that would come to define his approach to modern warfare. One of the most notable of these missions took place in 1989 in Beirut, Lebanon, a city still gripped by chaos following a brutal civil war. Tasked with locating an arms cache linked to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Barlow and his team operated under French passports, navigating Beirut's dangerous streets. This wasn't just a mission to find weapons. It was part of a broader strategy by the apartheid regime to disrupt potential arms smuggling routes that could supply anti-apartheid movements. Under constant threat from hostile factions, the mission quickly escalated and Barlow and his men had to fight their way out of Beirut. For more on the volatile landscape of Beirut and Lebanon in general, particularly during this era, check out our full in-depth video on it. These experiences were foundational. They taught him the value of intelligence, speed, and the psychological edge. And when the political winds changed in South Africa, this knowledge would be his ticket to a new kind of warfare. As the 1990s dawned, South Africa was on the path to a radical transformation. Apartheid was collapsing, Nelson Mandela was set to lead the nation into a new era of democracy, and the SADF was undergoing a major shakeup. Elite units like the 32nd Battalion and the CCB were being disbanded in favor of a more inclusive and democratic defense force. For the soldiers who had spent years in counterinsurgency operations and black ops, the future looked uncertain. These men were the best of the best, trained, hardened, and now without a purpose. Barlow saw this as an opportunity. These were men who knew how to fight and win against impossible odds, and he believed that their skills could be put to use in a different kind of battlefield, one where governments were losing control and insurgencies were on the rise. And so, in 1989, Eeben Barlow founded Executive Outcomes, not just as a business venture, but as a calculated move to harness this pool of military expertise and channel it where it was most needed and most profitable. At its outset, EO and its Special Forces training programs provided additional funding for Barlow's CCB operations. However, as his time in the CCB ended, Barlow's vision for EO shifted. Executive Outcomes would not just be another group of hired guns. It would be a professional corporate army, one that could be contracted by any government willing to pay for stability and victory. The name Executive Outcomes was deliberate, meant to convey professionalism, results, and a focus on delivering outcomes, not just chaos. This wasn't mercenary work. This was corporate warfare. The DNA of EO was unmistakably influenced by Barlow's time in military intelligence and the CCB. He brought in veterans who had been experts in sabotage, intelligence gathering, and psychological operations. These weren't the kind of men who needed a map and a marching order. They could work in the shadows, behind enemy lines, and deliver results with surgical precision. EO's operations weren't just about overwhelming force. They were about strategic finesse. When EO moved, it moved like a phantom, striking hard and fast, leaving a trail of confusion and disorder among its enemies. But what really set EO apart was Barlow's understanding that the future of warfare wasn't just in guns and boots, it was in minds and messages. EO's tactics were not just about who could shoot better or deploy faster, they were about who could think smarter, who could adapt quicker, and who could leverage both military might and psychological warfare to destabilize their opponents. Barlow knew that in this new era of privatized warfare, the winners would be those who could operate in the shadows and strike from the light. Executive Outcomes wasn't just a private military company. It was a revolutionary force on the modern battlefield, a finely tuned machine that thrived on adaptability, precision, and a no-nonsense approach to conflict resolution. While many see EO through the lens of its daring operations and battlefield successes, what really made EO stand out was its ability to function as a highly efficient corporate military hybrid. At its core, EO's operational philosophy went beyond traditional boots-on-the-ground tactics. It was about mastering strategic advantage, rapid mobility, and psychological dominance. The secret to EO's success? A unique blend of military discipline and corporate agility. EO was not some ragtag group of mercenaries. It was a well-oiled organization with a structure designed to maximize flexibility and effectiveness. Think of it less like a conventional army and more like a high-powered consultancy firm, except this one dealt in combat instead of business advice. Every mission EO undertook was treated as a project with a clear set of objectives, deadlines, and deliverables. Whether it was toppling a rebel stronghold, securing critical resources, or facilitating peace negotiations, EO's strategy was laser-focused on achieving specific, measurable outcomes. This project-based approach allowed EO to deploy highly specialized teams tailored to the unique demands of each mission, ensuring a level of efficiency and effectiveness that was often lacking in traditional state militaries. One of EO's key strengths was its ability to adapt to fluid situations. In the volatile post-Cold War African landscape, where political alliances and conflict dynamics could change overnight, EO needed to be light on its feet. The company was structured to integrate local intelligence swiftly and execute operations flawlessly. Unlike cumbersome state-run armies, which were often bogged down by bureaucracy and rigid hierarchies, EO could pivot decisively. This organizational fluidity provided an edge, enabling EO to outperform much larger and better equipped conventional forces that struggled to adapt to the constantly shifting realities on the ground. But adaptability wasn't just a byproduct of EO's structure, it was built into its core. Recruitment was a cornerstone of EO's strategy, and the company didn't just look for anyone with combat experience. EO specifically targeted former members of elite units from the South African Defence Force and the South African Police. These recruits weren't your average grunts. They were veterans with years of experience in counterinsurgency, guerrilla warfare, intelligence operations, and psychological warfare. By using this specific set of skills, EO could deploy operatives who were not only battle-hardened but also adept at blending tactical acumen with a deep understanding of local cultural and geographical landscape. This combination allowed EO teams to operate well in any environment, from the dense jungles of Angola to the thick undergrowth of Sierra Leone. And perhaps, most importantly, it allowed them to cultivate relationships with local communities, an often overlooked but critical element for effective intelligence gathering and minimizing local resistance in foreign conflict zones. EO's armament strategy was another example of its resourcefulness and pragmatism. Instead of relying on state-of-the-art, high-cost weaponry, EO chose a more cost-effective and versatile approach. The collapse of the Soviet Union flooded the market with surplus Russian military equipment. The company sourced a range of surplus weapons and vehicles, including Soviet-made Mi-17 and Mi-24 helicopters and BMP-1 armored vehicles, machines known not just for their power, but for their reliability in Africa's rugged terrain. These weren't fancy, high-tech gadgets. They were proven tools of war that could withstand the tough environments that EO operated in. This choice was deliberate, based on thorough assessments of the terrain and the nature of enemy forces. The result was a highly mobile and flexible force that could strike fast and hard and then disappear just as quickly. This hit-and-run capability became a hallmark of EO operations, allowing them to stay one step ahead of their adversaries. But EO's reliance on adaptability didn't stop at its organizational structure or its choice of armaments. Training was another crucial component. EO's training regimen for local forces was intense and comprehensive, tailored to enhance the unique skills that each recruit brought to the table. It wasn't just about marksmanship or physical endurance. EO's training covered a wide range of scenarios, from urban combat and guerrilla warfare to psychological operations and intelligence gathering. Operatives were trained to think on their feet, adapt to rapidly changing conditions, and execute missions with precision. EO wasn't just there to fight, but to build their capacity to sustain operations long after EO had left. This wasn't just about building goodwill. It was about creating a network of allied units that could provide valuable intelligence and logistical support in future operations, ensuring EO's enduring influence even after a contract ended. What really set EO apart from other military contractors was its ability to go beyond the direct application of force. While most PMCs focused on pure military muscle, EO saw the bigger picture, understanding that true success in conflict zones required more than just winning battles. It was about creating conditions for long-term stability and allowing governments to reassert control. EO's leadership, many of whom had backgrounds in special forces, intelligence, and covert operations, were acutely aware that military victory was only part of the equation. They often assisted in reorganizing local forces, establishing secure perimeters around key economic assets like mines and oil fields, and advising on peace negotiations. This approach, blending military force with strategic consulting and post-conflict stabilization, enabled EO to operate as a comprehensive service provider in the privatized war economy. EO's business model was revolutionary for its time. They didn't just sell military services. They sold a full-spectrum conflict solution that integrated combat operations, intelligence logistics, and even post-conflict reconstruction. When EO was contracted for a job, it didn't just show up with guns blazing. They studied the terrain, mapped out local dynamics, assessed political implications, and then executed a tailored strategy that would achieve their clients' goals efficiently. This approach to warfare blurred the lines between a military operation and a business consultancy. However, with innovation came controversy. As EO expanded its influence across Africa, the company inevitably stirred debate about the ethics and implications of privatized military intervention. Critics argued that EO represented a dangerous precedent, where corporate interests could dictate military engagements, potentially leading to conflicts driven more by profit motives than by genuine geopolitical or humanitarian concerns. This blurred line between corporate strategy and military action raised fundamental questions. Was EO just a mercenary group with a facelift, or were they pioneers of a new form of conflict resolution? For some, EO's ability to deliver quick and decisive results where traditional peacekeeping missions had failed was proof that the privatization of military force was an inevitable and positive evolution in the changing landscape of global conflict. Supporters pointed to EO's effectiveness in stabilizing volatile regions. In places like Angola and Sierra Leone, where national armies were either incapable or unwilling to intervene effectively, EO offered a path to stability. They provided a level of capability that many state forces just couldn't match, without the bureaucratic constraints that often bogged down international peacekeeping efforts. For many African governments facing existential threats from insurgencies and civil wars, EO wasn't just a last resort, they were a lifeline. In this sense, EO didn't just represent the privatization of military force. They represented a new form of geopolitical strategy where speed, efficiency, and results took precedence over the politics of intervention. Yet, as much as EO's approach was lauded for its effectiveness, it also showed the darker side of privatized warfare. The same flexibility and rapid deployment that made EO so effective on the battlefield also meant they could operate in legal and ethical grey zones. The nature of their work, which often involved securing strategic economic assets like oil fields and diamond mines, raised questions about whose interests were really being served. Were they liberators or exploiters? Peacemakers or profiteers? The truth, as is often the case, likely lay somewhere in between. As executive outcomes continued to redefine the rules of engagement across Africa, they forced the world to rethink the very nature of modern warfare. EO wasn't just a product of its time, it was a harbinger of things to come, a glimpse into a future where private military companies could play roles as significant as nation-states in shaping geopolitical landscapes. As executive outcomes expanded its influence across Africa, its operations in Angola became a defining moment. While we've already highlighted executive outcomes' groundbreaking operations in Angola earlier in this video, it's clear that their involvement in this country was more than just a brief chapter in their history. It's a story that demands its own spotlight. To understand the full impact of EO's involvement, it's crucial to grasp the deep-rooted complexities of the Angolan Civil War, a war that had its origins in Cold War proxy conflicts and lasted from 1974 until 2002. For those interested in a more detailed exploration of this conflict, check out our video, The Most Ideologically Charged Nation in Cold War Africa, Why Their Civil War Never Seemed to Stop, which delves deeper into the historical context, the Cold War dynamics, and the various international power plays that shaped Angola's civil war. The Angola Civil War was a vicious and multi-layered conflict that erupted after Angola gained independence from Portugal in 1975. Two main factions emerged: the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or the MPLA, a Marxist-Leninist group led by President José Eduardo dos Santos, which was the nominal ruling power in Angola and was supported by the Soviet Union. Opposing the MPLA was the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or the UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, which was anti-communist and supported by both the United States, South Africa, and other Western allies. The Civil War was characterized by a brutal struggle for power, where both sides employed guerrilla tactics, conventional warfare, and psychological operations. The MPLA, which controlled the capital, Luanda, and most urban centers, relied on Soviet and Cuban military support, while UNITA controlled large swaths of rural territory, particularly in the south and east, and was heavily funded by diamond revenues. By the early 1990s, Angola's civil war had reached a critical juncture. The MPLA government was facing severe military setbacks, an economic crisis exacerbated by the prolonged conflict, and the inability to secure a decisive victory over UNITA. The economy was crippled, primarily due to the war's destruction of infrastructure and international sanctions imposed during the Cold War. Compounding the economic issues, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s meant the loss of the main avenue of military support for the MPLA. The stakes were incredibly high. If the MPLA lost control, it could mean the collapse of a government that had ruled since independence. On the other side, Jonas Savimbi's UNITA was not just a rebel group. It had developed into a formidable force capable of conventional and guerrilla warfare, bolstered by extensive support networks and substantial revenue from diamond mining in the territories it controlled. UNITA's control over these diamond-rich regions gave it a steady flow of resources to buy weapons and fund its operations, creating a near state-like entity that challenged MPLA's sovereignty. In 1991, the Bosese Accords attempted to integrate UNITA into a unified national army and hold multi-party elections, but these efforts collapsed when both sides accused each other of fraud during the 1992 elections. What followed was one of the most intense and bloodiest phases of the conflict, with both sides escalating their military campaigns. By 1993, the MPLA government, desperate for a breakthrough, made a bold decision to hire EO. Executive Outcome's entry into Angola in 1993 was not just another PMC operation. It was a game-changing move that redefined the role of private forces in modern conflicts. Unlike the Angolan armed forces, which were often hampered by poor training, low morale, and logistical issues, EO brought a new level of discipline, strategic planning, and operational efficiency to the battlefield. Their intervention was not merely about deploying troops, but about achieving tangible results through training local forces with a sophisticated blend of intelligence, psychological operations, and highly coordinated assaults. EO's operations in Angola would prove that a small, elite force, properly trained and strategically deployed, could completely transform a long-running conflict. While EO spent considerable time training local Angolan forces, a cornerstone of EO's combat strategy was its seamless integration of air and ground operations, a tactic that was devastatingly effective. EO deployed their fleet of Soviet-made Mi-24 gunships and Mi-17 transport helicopters operated by highly skilled Ukrainian pilots from their sister company, Ibis Air. These aircraft were game changers on the battlefield, providing rapid mobility and overwhelming firepower that allowed EO to strike deep into enemy territory with speed and precision. The Mi-24, known for its armored protection and powerful armaments, could provide close air support to ground troops, conduct aerial assaults, and serve as a psychological weapon against an often poorly equipped army. Meanwhile, the Mi-17 transport helicopters facilitated rapid troop insertions and extractions, enabling EO to execute attacks on key UNITA positions before the rebels could react. EO's air-ground coordination was not random. It was the result of meticulous planning and intelligence gathering. Before each operation, EO utilized a combination of aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and a network of local informants to build a comprehensive picture of enemy movements and weaknesses. This intelligence-driven approach allowed them to carry out highly targeted strikes that dismantled UNITA's supply lines, neutralized their command centers, and disrupted their logistical networks. By focusing on high-value targets, EO forced UNITA to stretch their resources thin, making it incredibly difficult for them to mount effective counterattacks or sustain their control over strategic areas. EO's dominance was tested when UNITA launched a surprise attack on their base in Sarimo. Late one night, UNITA troops, disguised in Angolan army uniforms, infiltrated the camp's southern perimeter, catching EO off guard. The disguised rebels moved through the perimeter, waving at sentries as they passed, heading straight for EO's rapid reaction force and pilots' barracks. The camp erupted into chaos when a rebel leader shouted, "You whites must all come outside, we won't shoot you." This unexpected command, delivered in English, caused a brief moment of confusion among the EO men. The confusion quickly turned to action. Blaki Swart, an EO operative, immediately opened fire on the infiltrators, setting off a fierce firefight that would last nearly 2 hours. The battle illuminated the camp in flashes as tracers crisscrossed the dark sky, and the camp's mortars responded to the barrage unleashed by UNITA. In the midst of the battle, EO's Mi-17 helicopter was hit by an RPG-7, erupting into flames and adding to the chaos. Despite the unexpected attack and initial losses, EO's men fought back with ferocity. When the fighting finally subsided and UNITA withdrew, EO quickly regrouped. Determined to respond, EO mobilized their remaining air assets, including a Pilatus PC-7 ground attack aircraft, which had been out of service for maintenance, and a MiG-23, whose pilots had been away for training. Under Colonel Panpiena's command, EO launched a series of retaliatory airstrikes targeting UNITA positions around Kafunfu. These airstrikes disrupted UNITA's supply lines and demoralized their troops. The retaliation didn't end there. EO organized a mechanized assault on Lubalu, a key UNITA stronghold north of Kakolo. EO launched a fast mechanized attack with rapid armored assaults from BMPs. The operation was a resounding success, resulting in heavy UNITA casualties and further degradation of their operational capabilities. One of EO's most significant achievements in Angola was the recapture of the Soya oil installations in the northern part of the country. Soya was vital for the MPLA government not only because of its economic value, but also because it was a key logistical hub that UNITA had been using to stage operations and cut off government resources. EO's forces launched a well-coordinated operation combining rapid helicopter insertions with a ground assault to overwhelm UNITA forces. The operation was swift and brutal, demonstrating EO's ability to combine firepower with speed and surprise. The successful recapture of Soyo not only deprived UNITA of a critical asset, but also sent a powerful message that the tide of war was turning in the favor of the government. The impact of EO's presence was not limited to battlefield victories. EO also focused heavily on the psychological dimension of warfare, understanding that winning hearts and minds could be just as decisive as capturing territory. They capitalized on their reputation as a highly efficient and ruthless fighting force, using it to demoralize UNITA forces and create a sense of fear and uncertainty within their ranks. Stories of EO's rapid assaults, overwhelming firepower, and relentless pursuit spread quickly, causing many UNITA fighters to abandon their positions or defect. This psychological strategy was backed by efforts to present EO as professional problem solvers, dedicated to bringing stability to Angola rather than mere mercenaries. EO's approach also included a strong emphasis on training and empowering local forces, understanding that long-term success required more than just military victories. It required sustainable stability. EO provided extensive training to the Angolan Armed Forces, or the FAA, focusing on counterinsurgency tactics, urban combat techniques, and intelligence operations. This training not only improved the immediate effectiveness of the FAA, but also helped create a more capable and professional military force that could maintain control and order after EO's eventual departure. By strengthening local forces, EO made sure that the FAA could keep up the pressure on UNITA even after they left, reinforcing the government's hold. Despite their successes, EO's operations in Angola were not without controversy. The company was often criticized for its aggressive tactics and the potential for human rights abuses. There were concerns from international observers and human rights organizations about the ethical implications of a private military company being compensated with diamond concessions. This raised significant questions about the motives behind EO's involvement and the broader dangers of commodifying conflict. Critics argued that such arrangements created perverse incentives where PMCs might prioritize profit over peace. Yet, EO's effectiveness in Angola demonstrated the potential of PMCs to achieve significant strategic outcomes where local conventional military forces had failed. Their ability to operate with precision, flexibility, and speed, combined with a clear strategic vision, enabled them to push UNITA back, disrupt their economic base, and force them to the negotiating table. The Lusaka Protocol, signed in 1994, was a direct consequence of the pressure exerted by EO and the FAA on UNITA. Although the peace achieved through the Lusaka Protocol was fragile and eventually unraveled, EO's role in bringing UNITA to the negotiating table set a precedent for future engagements. However, the end of EO's contract in Angola did not mean an end to their influence. Even as they withdrew, they left behind a more capable Angolan military that had been strengthened by EO's training programs and combat experience. The lessons learned in Angola about the importance of flexibility, intelligence, integration, and psychological operations would soon be put to the test in another volatile African region, Sierra Leone. The challenges in Sierra Leone were just as daunting, if not more so, but EO's reputation as a decisive and highly capable force would follow them into the next chapter of their operations across Africa. As executive outcomes concluded its operations in Angola, the company quickly pivoted to another major conflict, the civil war in Sierra Leone. This war was not just another African conflict. It was a humanitarian catastrophe characterized by some of the most brutal tactics ever witnessed on the continent. For those interested in a deeper exploration of the Sierra Leone Civil War and its broader implications, check out our video that covers the full historical and geopolitical context in detail. The Sierra Leone Civil War, which raged from 1991 to 2002, was a complex conflict fueled by political corruption, economic decline, and a fierce battle over the country's rich diamond reserves. It began when the Revolutionary United Front, led by Foday Sanko, launched a rebellion against the government, vowing to overthrow what they saw as a corrupt and incompetent regime. The Revolutionary United Front, or the RUF, backed by Charles Taylor's National Patriotic Front of Liberia, quickly gained control over significant portions of the country, including the diamond-rich regions that became the lifeblood of their war effort. These diamonds, often referred to as blood diamonds due to their role in fueling violence, became the central currency of the conflict, providing both sides with the means to sustain their campaigns. The tactics used by the RUF were nothing short of horrific. They conducted a campaign of terror against the civilian population, employing gruesome methods such as mass amputations, sexual violence, and the recruitment of child soldiers. These brutal tactics were designed to instill fear, break the will of the people, and assert control over territory. By the mid-1990s, the RUF had gained control over much of the country, pushing the government and its forces to the brink. The Sierra Leone Army, or the RSLMF, was poorly trained, underfunded, and riddled with corruption, making it nearly impossible to mount a coordinated defense against the RUF's relentless assaults. Faced with a deteriorating situation, President Valentine Strasser and his government were forced to seek outside help. Who better than Executive Outcomes, the private military company that had just turned the tide in Angola? EO's arrival in Sierra Leone in 1995 marked a new chapter in the war. Drawing from their experience in Angola, where they had successfully reversed the tide against UNITA rebels, EO deployed around 160 battle-hardened operatives, drawing from a deep pool of experience honed in South Africa's fiercest conflicts. Unlike the demoralized and disorganized Sierra Leonean army, EO introduced a new standard of precision, planning, and adaptability that the RUF had never encountered before. Their primary mission was to first relieve the immediate danger on Freetown and then reclaim the diamond-rich Kono district, a vital source of revenue for the government and a critical target for breaking the RUF's stranglehold on the country. The operation to retake Kono was the centerpiece of EO's strategy. The district was crucial, not just for its diamond mines, but for the psychological impact that retaking it would have on the RUF and the broader conflict. Like in Angola, where they had employed rapid, highly coordinated assaults to recapture key territories, EO utilized a combination of air and ground tactics to overwhelm the RUF forces. As in previous conflicts, EO relied heavily on their Mi-24 gunships and Mi-17 transport helicopters, initially piloted by Ukrainian crews from their sister company Ibis Air for air support and rapid troop deployment. However, unlike in Angola, Executive Outcomes would transition to their own pilots shortly after arriving in Sierra Leone. EO's ground forces, trained in rapid assaults and search and destroy tactics, followed closely behind, clearing out entrenched rebel positions and reclaiming strategic locations. EO's success in Kono was not only a military victory but also a significant psychological blow to the RUF. The loss of Kono cut off the rebels' access to diamond revenues, severely impacting their ability to finance their operations. This swift and decisive action sent shockwaves through the RUF ranks, leading to defections and a decline in morale. Much like in Angola, where EO had managed to demoralize UNITA forces through relentless assaults and strategic superiority, the company applied similar principles in Sierra Leone, showing that they could adapt their tactics to different combat environments with equal effectiveness. But EO's campaign in Sierra Leone did not stop at Kono. They undertook a series of operations across the country aimed at dismantling the RUF's infrastructure and weakening their capacity to wage war. One of the most notable operations involved securing the Sierra Rutile and the Sierra Leone Ore and Metal Company bauxite mines in the southern region of Sierra Leone. These sites were vital to the country's economy and had been targeted by the RUF to disrupt government revenues. EO launched a coordinated assault to secure these positions, deploying their Mi-24 gunships for targeted aerial bombardments, while ground forces moved in to conduct mop-up operations. This swift offensive not only secured a critical stronghold for the government, but also delivered a severe blow to the RUF, further diminishing their operational capabilities. Another pivotal operation during EO's campaign in Sierra Leone was the liberation of Leone district, a strategic stronghold of the RUF. The district's dense jungle terrain, coupled with its proximity to the borders of Guinea and Liberia, provided a safe haven for the RUF, who used it as a base for launching raids and retreats. By 1995, Leone had become a nerve center for rebel operations with well-fortified camps deep within the jungle. The mission to liberate this area would not be easy. It required a careful blend of intelligence, air power, and ground assaults. EO's breakthrough came when they arrested Foday Sanko's wife, who was attempting to sell diamonds illegally. Under interrogation, she revealed detailed information about the locations and setups of RUF bases, allowing EO to develop an unprecedented understanding of the RUF's order of battle. This intelligence was vital. EO dispatched their Mi-17 helicopters and Cessna 337 light aircraft to conduct reconnaissance missions under the guise of resupply flights to Koidu. Using night vision goggles, EO operatives identified RUF campfires below, confirming their positions, and fixed the location via GPS. EO then initiated a meticulously planned series of air assaults. An Mi-24 helicopter, equipped with rockets and machine guns, flew low over the jungle canopy at night, catching the rebels off guard. Above, the Cessna 337 acted as a forward air control platform, coordinating the strikes. As the Mi-24 unleashed their firepower, tearing through the RUF's jungle encampments, the Mi-17s ferried in ground forces rapidly to flush out any remaining fighters. The jungle came alive with the sounds of explosions and gunfire as the combined air and ground assault decimated RUF positions. The relentless campaign had a profound psychological impact on the RUF. The rebels, who had believed their jungle bases to be impenetrable, were now fleeing into neighboring countries, their morale shattered. By the end of November 1995, the entire Leone district was liberated. EO's operation dismantled the RUF's safe havens, disrupted their supply lines, and crippled their ability to wage war from these positions, dramatically shifting the dynamics of the conflict in favor of the Sierra Leonean government. EO's effectiveness in Sierra Leone was not solely based on overwhelming force. Intelligence played a critical role in their strategy. They established a wide-ranging network of local informants and collaborated closely with local militias like the Kamajors. The Kamajors were traditional hunters with an intimate knowledge of the terrain and RUF movements, providing EO with invaluable intelligence on enemy positions, supply routes, and tactics. This intelligence-driven approach allowed EO to preemptively strike at RUF strongholds, cut off supply lines, and disrupt their operations in ways the Sierra Leonean army had never been able to achieve. EO's intervention also created opportunities for humanitarian relief, an aspect that often goes underreported amidst the stories of combat. With major towns and regions secured from RUF control, international aid organizations were able to enter these areas and provide much-needed assistance to civilians who had been living under siege. Like in Angola, where EO's operations opened pathways for post-conflict recovery and rebuilding, their actions in Sierra Leone enabled critical humanitarian efforts to take place. This dual role, both as military operators and facilitators of humanitarian access, added layers to EO's involvement, positioning them as more than just a private army. However, as was the case in Angola, EO's presence in Sierra Leone was mired in controversy. UNESCO accused EO of numerous crimes. Other reports emerged suggesting that their involvement was not driven purely by humanitarian concerns. Allegations surfaced that EO's compensation included diamond mining concessions arranged through companies like Branch Energy, which had financial ties to EO. This arrangement raised significant ethical questions about the motives behind EO's operations and the potential conflicts of interest that could arise when a private military company is both a security provider and an economic stakeholder. Critics argued that such deals blurred the lines between military objectives and profit-driven motives, much like the controversies surrounding EO's involvement in Angola. Despite these controversies, the immediate impact of EO's operations on the civil war in Sierra Leone was undeniable. Within months of their deployment, EO had managed to drive the RUF out of key areas, including critical diamond mining regions, thereby cutting off their revenue streams and forcing them to retreat. The pressure exerted by EO's operations opened the door for peace negotiations, leading to a ceasefire and the signing of the Abidjan Peace Accord in 1996. While this peace was also fragile and ultimately collapsed, EO's intervention created a temporary window for political processes to unfold, an achievement that had seemed out of reach before their arrival. EO's actions in Sierra Leone further sparked debate on the use of private military companies in conflict zones. Supporters highlighted EO's ability to achieve what larger state-run armies and international peacekeepers could not, arguing that private military companies, like EO, could serve as effective force multipliers in asymmetric warfare. Critics, however, maintained that EO's operations, like in Angola, raised serious concerns about accountability and the potential for PMCs to operate outside the bounds of international law. They argued that when private interests drive military action, the line between securing peace and pursuing profit can become dangerously blurred. As EO's contract in Sierra Leone ended, the company left behind a nation still grappling with the scars of civil war, but with a glimmer of hope for a sustainable peace. The same traits that had brought them success in Angola, adaptability, intelligence integration, and strategic risk-taking, were evident in their operations in Sierra Leone, solidifying their status as a powerful player in modern conflicts. However, their legacy remained as complex as ever, defined by both tactical brilliance and ethical ambiguity. As executive outcomes made its mark on conflict zones like Angola and Sierra Leone, the company's operations sparked intense controversy and ethical debates. While EO was often lauded for its military effectiveness in altering the tides of war and stabilizing volatile regions, it was equally accused of engaging in activities that breached legal and ethical boundaries. Some viewed EO as a humanitarian savior, others condemned it as a rogue entity driven by profit rather than principle. This duality in perception has led to sharp divisions, challenging the very nature of privatized warfare and the role of PMCs in global conflicts. A significant controversy surrounding EO was the persistent label of being mercenaries in disguise. Despite efforts to present itself as a legitimate corporate entity providing military solutions for unstable regions, EO's actions often mirrored those of traditional mercenaries, working for whoever could afford their services. This was especially evident in Angola, where EO's involvement in the civil war raised ethical questions. Initially, the company's soldiers, at the time still enlisted in the SADF, supported UNITA during the 80s, fighting on behalf of an anti-communist ally during apartheid. By the early 1990s, however, they switched allegiances to fight against UNITA for the MPLA government. This quick reversal underscored the transactional nature of EO's operations, where financial motives often outweighed consistent ethical principles, blurring the line between legitimate military contractors and hired guns. EO faced direct allegations of human rights abuses and war crimes, particularly during its operations in Sierra Leone. The company was accused of using excessive force and employing harsh tactics that often crossed the line into indiscriminate violence. Eyewitness reports suggested that EO operatives carried out summary executions of suspected RUF fighters, including child soldiers, and conducted operations that resulted in significant civilian casualties. EO's tactics were described as involving overwhelming force, often through preemptive strikes that led to collateral damage. Allegations of mistreating prisoners and employing brutal interrogation methods further tainted their reputation, raising serious concerns about the accountability and oversight of PMCs in conflict zones. Despite these controversies, EO maintained that its missions adhered to strict rules of engagement designed to protect civilians from the RUF's brutality. Still, the inherent dangers of unchecked corporate military power, especially in fragile conflict zones, became glaringly apparent. EO's actions stirred a debate on the consequences of allowing private forces to operate without the same legal constraints binding national armies, and whether such forces inflame conflicts rather than resolve them. Yet, EO's controversial operations were not without attempts to aid those caught in the crossfire, complicating the narrative of their role in conflict zones. After securing key diamond-rich territories in Sierra Leone from RUF control, EO provided armed escorts for aid convoys, reopening vital supply routes that had been blocked for months. This allowed critical food, medical supplies, and other resources to reach thousands of displaced civilians. EO's strategy included limited civic action programs aimed more at leveraging local goodwill and securing operational control than purely humanitarian efforts. Nevertheless, their presence did provide some degree of stability and relief to war-torn areas. EO's financial dealings added another layer to the controversy with their acceptance of lucrative diamond mining concessions as part of their compensation. This business model, particularly in Angola and Sierra Leone, blurred the lines between military operations and commercial enterprise. Critics accused EO of war profiteering, arguing that their military objectives were more aligned with securing resources than achieving peace. Their relationships with companies like Strategic Resources Corporation and Branch Energy only deepened suspicions that EO's actions were motivated by profit rather than genuine stability-building efforts. In Sierra Leone, the company was hired to stabilize a government on the brink of collapse under the RUF's assault. While EO's military success was clear, recapturing key territories and restoring government control, allegations emerged that EO manipulated local political processes to favor their corporate interests. If true, these accusations of covert political interference only further blurred the line between military contractor and mercenary force, calling into question the ethical implications of EO's operations. The controversy surrounding EO reached its peak when the company became implicated in the blood diamond trade, a practice that exemplified the darker side of resource-driven conflicts in the late 20th century. Blood diamonds, or conflict diamonds, mined under conditions involving severe human rights abuses, became a critical source of funding for rebel groups in Angola and Sierra Leone. EO's acceptance of diamond concessions tied them directly to this issue, fueling accusations that their military operations were designed to perpetuate conflict and control resources rather than foster peace. The Kimberley process, initiated in the late 1990s to curb the trade in conflict diamonds, further constrained EO's ability to operate as it had previously. This association with blood diamonds ultimately damaged EO's reputation and made it increasingly difficult for the company to attract new clients. Governments and corporations could no longer afford the reputational risk of associating with a company seen as profiting from human rights abuses, child labor, and violence. Despite these controversies, it's undeniable that EO filled a critical gap where traditional forces and peacekeeping operations had failed. In places like Sierra Leone, where state forces were ineffective, corrupt, or simply non-existent, EO's military professionalism and decisive action helped to restore a semblance of order. They didn't just turn the tide against the RUF, they stabilized key regions, allowing humanitarian aid to flow and ultimately creating conditions for recovery. In many cases, EO succeeded where state armies and international peacekeepers had repeatedly fallen short, suggesting that perhaps there's a place for PMCs in modern conflict zones when conventional approaches fail. Yet, this raises a key question. Does the end justify the means? EO's ability to act as both destroyer and savior undeniably leaves a complex legacy, but it's hard to argue with the results. In war-torn regions where chaos reigned, EO left behind a level of stability that traditional forces simply didn't achieve. Yes, they operated in murky legal and ethical grey areas and their profit motives were clear, but in the aftermath, regions like Sierra Leone were better off than before EO arrived. Sometimes, in the harshest environments, the swift and often brutal interventions of a private military force like EO may be the only way to restore peace. While EO's legacy is far from pristine, it serves as a potent reminder that in extreme situations, the ends however uncomfortable, can sometimes justify the means. The dissolution of executive outcomes in 1998 was not merely the end of a company, but the culmination of mounting political, legal, and economic pressures that made its continued existence impossible. After the end of apartheid and the election of Nelson Mandela as president in 1994, the new government was determined to distance itself from the militarized and covert operations that defined the apartheid era. EO, largely composed of former South African Defence Force personnel and deeply associated with apartheid-era military interventions, became a glaring symbol of the past that Mandela's administration sought to move away from. To build a new, peaceful, and democratic image for South Africa, the government could not afford to be seen as the base for a high-profile private military company that was active in international conflict zones. This political shift led to tangible legislative changes. In 1998, South Africa passed the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act, a law aimed squarely at curbing the activities of mercenaries and private military companies operating from within the country. The act required South African citizens and companies to obtain government approval before offering military services abroad, effectively making EO's business model illegal. While Eeben Barlow asserts in his book that EO did in fact have a license to operate after the FMAA, rather than facing the legal risks and significant restrictions that would come with attempting to comply with the new regulations, EO opted to shut down. The political climate, combined with new legal constraints, rendered the company's operations unsustainable, marking the beginning of its end. Simultaneously, EO was under intense scrutiny from the international community. As EO became more prominent, especially due to its involvement in the conflicts in Angola and Sierra Leone, its practices drew criticism from foreign governments, international bodies like the United Nations, and human rights organizations. EO's Diamonds for Services model, where it accepted lucrative mining concessions as partial payment for its military operations, raised serious ethical and legal concerns. Allegations of human rights abuses, including possible war crimes such as torture and extrajudicial killings, further stained EO's reputation. The controversy surrounding EO made it increasingly difficult for any government or corporation to publicly associate with the company without facing international backlash, effectively isolating EO from potential clients. Economically, EO's model was becoming increasingly unviable. While EO's acceptance of diamond concessions and other natural resources had initially seemed like a profitable strategy, the growing international efforts to regulate conflict diamonds and crack down on war profiteering made such payments a double-edged sword. As the pressure mounted, EO found itself struggling to secure contracts without facing severe international condemnation or sanctions. Combined with the shifting dynamics of African conflicts, where the demand for high-intensity combat operations began to decline as peace processes took hold, EO's revenue streams dried up and its business model became financially unsustainable. The process of dissolving EO was strategic and calculated. Recognizing that their high-profile presence had become a liability, EO's leadership decided to wind down operations quietly. The company chose not to renew or pursue new contracts that would expose it to further scrutiny and controversy. Key figures within EO, including founder Eeben Barlow, anticipated the need for a lower profile approach. They transitioned into smaller, more discreet ventures that could continue providing security and military consulting services without attracting the same level of attention. This included the creation of new entities like STEP International, which focused on training and advisory roles while avoiding direct military engagement. These new ventures carried forward the tactics and strategies honed by EO, but operated under a different guise, allowing former EO operatives to remain active in the field without the legal and reputational baggage of their former company. While EO's closure in 1998 marked the end of its formal operations, its legacy had already begun to permeate the evolving landscape of modern warfare. As the company dissolved, its methods, along with its controversies, paved the way for a new breed of private military companies that would follow in its footsteps, refining and expanding the model EO pioneered. EO may have officially closed its doors in 1998, but its influence on the private military industry endured. As state forces struggled to adapt to post-Cold War conflicts, EO's model, blending intelligence-driven missions with rapid deployment and specialized combat units, became the blueprint for the next generation of private military companies. Look no further than Blackwater, which was later rebranded as Academy in the United States, DynCorp International, or Russia's Wagner Group. These companies didn't just follow in EO's footsteps, they sprinted down the path EO carved, tweaking the playbook to suit their own geopolitical agendas and operational realities. Blackwater, one of the most notorious PMCs to emerge after EO's dissolution, built its reputation by embracing EO's aggressive, results-driven approach. Founded by former Navy SEAL Eric Prince, Blackwater, like EO, marketed itself as a solution to the limitations of traditional state militaries. In Iraq, Blackwater quickly became the go-to security provider for the US government, securing billions in contracts for high-risk operations. Its speed, adaptability, and willingness to take decisive action mirrored EO's tactics in Angola and Sierra Leone. Both companies operated with an overwhelming force philosophy, executing missions with an intensity that prioritized results, often disregarding the potential consequences. The infamous 2007 Nissos Square massacre in Baghdad, where Blackwater operatives killed 17 Iraqi civilians, serves as a harsh reminder of the perils of privatized military power. This incident, which sparked global outrage, was a chilling echo of the ethical and accountability issues EO faced in Angola and Sierra Leone. In both cases, the companies operated in a murky legal zone where swift, decisive action often came at the expense of clear accountability. They exposed the darker side of private warfare, the potential for unchecked violence, the erosion of state authority, and the ethical tightrope walked by those who turn war into a business. Then there's DynCorp International, a different beast in the PMC world, but one that still carries EO's DNA. While Blackwater thrived in the chaos of direct combat, DynCorp found its niche in training local forces, providing security for diplomatic missions and offering logistical and aviation support in hotspots like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Colombia. But don't be fooled. This wasn't just support work. DynCorp's approach echoes EO's model of mixing military prowess with corporate efficiency, proving that security could be both a service and a strategy. DynCorp's role in training the Afghan National Police and Afghan National Army was a cornerstone of US strategy in Afghanistan, much like EO's role in training and stabilizing local forces in Africa. But it wasn't all clean and clinical. Allegations of human rights abuses, corruption, and even involvement in human trafficking in Bosnia during the early 2000s have dogged DynCorp's operations. These scandals revealed the same ethical quandaries EO encountered when profits, power, and geopolitics collide in unstable regions. While DynCorp may not have been on the front lines like Blackwater, the company's operations underscore how PMCs, regardless of their specific roles, are always in the crosshairs of controversy. And who could forget the Wagner Group? If you want a modern-day equivalent of EO's shadowy but impactful operations, Wagner is it. Active from Syria to Ukraine to Africa, Wagner operates in a legal grey zone, much like EO did, blurring the lines between state-sponsored missions and private corporate interests. Wagner's ability to deploy highly skilled units that seamlessly integrate with local forces and leverage intelligence networks has EO written all over it. Take their involvement in Syria, where Wagner played a critical role in supporting Bashar al-Assad's regime. This wasn't just about boots on the ground. It was a masterclass in blending direct military action with psychological warfare and disinformation, tactics EO had mastered decades earlier. In Africa, Wagner has employed EO's model almost to the letter by securing economic assets like mining concessions in exchange for military services. And Wagner's corporate strategy? It's EO's playbook all over again. A maze of shell companies and front organizations designed to dodge international sanctions and legal oversight, allowing them to operate in some of the world's most unstable regions with minimal accountability. This strategy is a mirror of EO's use of entities like Strategic Resources Corporation and Branch Energy to carry out operations while masking direct involvement. It's proof that the tactics EO perfected continue to shape the PMC industry. EO's impact is also evident in the broader strategies of today's PMCs. The blending of direct military force with consulting, logistics, and post-conflict stabilization is now a standard model employed by companies like G4S and Triple Canopy. These PMCs, much like EO, have broadened their services beyond just armed security to include risk assessment, training, and infrastructure support in conflict-ridden regions. This diversification reflects EO's understanding that modern warfare and security aren't just about combat. They're about winning hearts and minds, stabilizing economies, and shaping governance structures. EO demonstrated that a PMC could be more than just a hired gun. It could be an architect of geopolitical change. The continued expansion of PMCs has fueled ongoing debates about the role of privatized military forces in today's world. Should PMCs, motivated by profit and operating with significant autonomy, have the power to influence conflicts and shape the fate of nations? And if so, who ensures they're held accountable? EO's actions in the 90s brought these questions to the forefront, and they're still unresolved as PMCs continue to expand their influence across the globe. EO's dissolution in the late 90s was the end of its direct operations, but not the end of its story. EO showed what PMCs could achieve, both the good and the bad, when they were free to operate in the murky intersections of war, profit, and geopolitics. EO's model demonstrated the potential for PMCs to be effective force multipliers in conflicts where state militaries were unable or unwilling to intervene. But it also underscored the inherent risks of allowing private entities to wield military power without adequate oversight, regulation, or accountability. The ethical and practical dilemmas EO highlighted have spurred efforts to establish more robust regulations and oversight for PMCs. The United Nations and other international bodies have pushed for frameworks to ensure PMCs adhere to international humanitarian law and respect human rights. The Montreux document, spearheaded by Switzerland and the International Committee of the Red Cross in 2008, is one such example, offering a set of guidelines on the use of PMCs in armed conflicts. It emphasizes state responsibility, transparency, and the need for companies to operate within the bounds of international law. The Montreux document is supported by over 50 countries and key international organizations like the European Union, NATO, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, all recognizing the growing need to regulate an industry that can wield substantial power with minimal oversight. However, the Montreux document has its limitations. It remains a non-binding instrument, lacking the enforcement mechanisms necessary to hold PMCs and their host states accountable. Critics argue that without mandatory compliance and punitive measures for violations, the guidelines are insufficient to curb the worst abuses of the industry. Countries with weaker regulatory frameworks or those that covertly rely on PMCs to further state interests have also shown reluctance to fully endorse or implement the document's provisions. Some human rights organizations and advocacy groups have called for even stronger regulations that not only emphasize state oversight, but also ensure transparency, accountability, and reparations for victims of abuses committed by PMCs. The International Code of Conduct for Private Security Service Providers, launched in 2010, represents an important step forward, establishing accountability in the private security industry. It sets out clear standards for private military and security companies to follow in respecting human rights and international humanitarian law when operating in conflict zones and fragile states. The ICOC covers key principles including the appropriate use of force, prohibitions against torture and human trafficking, as well as recruitment and trafficking protocols to ensure company personnel adhere to the highest ethical standards. In 2013, the ICOC Association was established to provide independent oversight through certification, monitoring, and compliant mechanisms. While the code is a significant advance, with over 700 companies as signatories, it is a voluntary instrument. Critics argue that without binding legal reinforcement and punitive measures, it lacks the teeth to fully regulate PMCs and prevent potential abuses. Nonetheless, the ICOC is a pivotal initiative in establishing a framework of transparency and ethical behavior within the private security sector. Despite these efforts, a comprehensive international regulatory system for PMCs remains elusive. The Montreux document, while a significant step toward formalizing standards and practices, falls short of creating a binding global framework. Much like in EO's operational heyday, PMCs today still often operate in a grey area, an ambiguity that allows them both their power and their notoriety. The legacy of EO, along with the ongoing evolution of companies like Blackwater, Wagner Group and DynCorp, shows that without stricter enforceable regulations, PMCs will continue to navigate the blurred lines between legal military support and unlawful mercenary activity. The debate surrounding the Montreux document and other regulatory initiatives underscore the urgent need for the international community to address these challenges head-on if they're to prevent future abuses and ensure accountability in the privatized war economy. EO's story, however, didn't end with its dissolution in 1998. In a surprising twist, Executive Outcomes was re-established in 2020, signaling a return of the controversial yet pioneering private military company. While the revived EO claims to operate under stricter ethical guidelines and a renewed focus on transparency, the very fact that it was reformed speaks to the enduring demand for highly specialized, adaptable military forces that can operate where traditional armies and peacekeeping missions fall short. As conflicts evolve in complexity and global security threats become more asymmetric, EO's resurgence suggests that the model it created is becoming relevant once again. Yet, with its re-establishment comes a familiar set of challenges. Can the new EO strike a balance between operational success and ethical accountability, or will its past controversies continue to shadow its future? Time will tell if EO's second act can reshape the conversation around a privatized military force in a more positive light. Executive Outcomes has left a profound and polarizing legacy in the world of modern conflict and warfare. While its methods were controversial and accusations of profiteering and human rights abuses followed the company, it's impossible to ignore the effectiveness of EO's operations. EO's interventions in Angola and Sierra Leone were pivotal, delivering results where traditional state forces struggled to make a meaningful impact. By integrating intelligence, rapid deployment, and highly specialized combat units, EO created a model that defined how private military forces could shape the outcomes of wars. EO's rise to prominence came at a time when the global geopolitical landscape was shifting dramatically. The end of the Cold War and the decline of direct foreign intervention left many conflict-ridden regions, particularly in Africa, in a state of flux. Governments in these conflict zones, struggling with internal collapse, turned toward EO as a swift solution to their security problems. Into this void they stepped, offering a highly specialized elite military force that could deliver results where traditional state armies and international peacekeeping efforts had failed. In Angola, EO demonstrated that a well-organized, intelligence-driven private force could achieve what state armies could not. Their ability to integrate air and ground operations combined with rapid mobility and strategic psychological warfare effectively disrupted UNITA's control over diamond-rich regions, securing vital resources for the MPLA government. Similarly, in Sierra Leone, EO's intervention against the Revolutionary United Front stabilized key regions and allowed humanitarian aid to flow into areas that had been devastated by rebel control. EO's operations didn't just bring military victories, they created the conditions for recovery and peace building. In both cases, EO's methods, though unconventional and controversial, delivered results that traditional forces had repeatedly failed to achieve. However, EO's success on the battlefield came with its share of ethical dilemmas. Their willingness to accept payment in the form of diamond concessions tied their military objectives directly to profit, raising questions about their true motivations. The accusations of war crimes, including excessive force and questionable treatment of prisoners, cannot be ignored. But in the face of repeated failures by international peacekeepers and state forces, EO provided a decisive force that restored order, even if it came at a moral cost. This forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of privatized military operations. Can we accept morally complex actions if they deliver stability and peace? EO's dissolution in 1998, under pressure from the South African government and the broader international community, marked the end of an era. Yet the strategies and tactics EO pioneered did not disappear with the company. They were adapted and expanded upon by other PMCs that followed. The influence of EO on modern PMCs is undeniable. Their ability to integrate corporate strategy with military operations, leverage local intelligence, and employ rapid, decisive force has become standard operating procedure for PMCs operating in conflict zones worldwide. This has created a new paradigm in modern warfare where the line between state and non-state actors is increasingly blurred. These companies have expanded EO's model, creating a new paradigm where private military forces operate with unprecedented influence, shaping conflicts in ways traditional forces cannot. Their operations in Ukraine, Syria, and across Africa reflect a continuation of the same principles EO set forth, but with potentially even greater geopolitical ramifications. Yes, EO's legacy is complex, entwined with ethical dilemmas around profit motives and legal grey areas. Yet, their success in stabilizing volatile regions begs the question: should we judge them solely by their controversies, or also by the tangible results they delivered? EO didn't just bring military victories. They restored fragile order in places where chaos reigned, giving countries a renewed chance at peace that may not have been possible otherwise. The debate over the privatization of warfare is unlikely to be settled anytime soon, but EO's story serves as a potent reminder that private military companies can play an essential role in resolving conflicts where state and international efforts fall short. As PMCs continue to shape global security, from Africa to the Middle East and beyond, the need for stronger regulations, oversight, and accountability becomes ever more pressing. Yet, EO's legacy shows that in extreme situations, PMCs can offer solutions that traditional forces cannot, however morally complex those solutions may be. So, while EO's story is far from pristine, it stands as a testament to the fact that, in some situations, the ends can indeed justify the means, if we're willing to confront the moral cost. As PMCs continue to shape conflicts across modern battlefields, the real question is, are we prepared to accept the consequences of letting private military companies define the rules of war? And there you have it, the story of executive outcomes, the pioneering yet controversial PMC that changed the face of modern warfare, emerging from the chaos of Africa's conflicts. But now, it's over to you. What are your thoughts on PMCs like executive outcomes? Do they have a role to play in the 21st century and beyond, or are they relics of a past best left behind? Should PMCs continue to operate in the legal grey areas that give them their edge, or is it time for stronger, clearer regulations to keep them in check? And if we do regulate them, what should those rules look like? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this video, you'll definitely enjoy reading the books we based a lot of our information off, which are Executive Outcomes Against All Odds by Eeben Barlow and Operation Certain Death by Damian Lewis. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Help us fight back against YouTube censorship and join us over at Armchair History TV, where we can make exclusive content without worrying about what the YouTube overlords deem as acceptable historical content. Use the link below and with the code THEFRONT on sign up to get 50% off a monthly or annual subscription.